Thank you. We'll share my screen and we can get started. So first, I want to thank you for inviting me to join you all today on this very interesting topic around the mind and the future. And I just want to start with some financial disclosures, which I'm required to present. I actually won't be presenting much on some of the app-based mindfulness training programs that we have developed, but any conflicts of interest are managed by Brown University. I'd like to start with a story. Some of you may know this story. This is a picture or a portrait of a man named Dazu Huika. And Huika is said to have been very interested in learning meditation. And he sought out a teacher named Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma was meditating in a cave and was meditating a lot. And Huika asked him to help him out. In fact, he asked him 3 times. And eventually, Bodhidharma said, "What do you want?" Huika said, "My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind." Bodhidharma said, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Huika replied, "When I look for my mind, I cannot find it." Bodhidharma said, "There, I have pacified it for you." So we can start with this little pondering. My mind is not at ease. When I look for my mind, I cannot find it. And somehow that is what pacifies it for us. And so today I will be talking about the mind and mindfulness and how this relates to some of the work that is ongoing around psychedelics and the overlap between the two. So starting with not just this ancient story, but with some of the Buddhist teachings. There's a phrase in the Pali Canon that says, whatever a person frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of the mind. And so we can start by not getting into esoteric debates about what the mind is, but a functional exploration. What is it that leads to dis-ease? My mind is not at ease. And so here it is said, if you look at the Pali Canon, there's a framework that was described that the Buddha was said to have been pondering the night of his enlightenment. It's called dependent origination. And it shares a lot of characteristics with modern day psychology. And the basic framework, I'm just using a simplified version here, is that a cue or a trigger comes into our mind. So it could be any of the 5 senses, or it could even be a thought. And our mind interprets this generally as pleasant or unpleasant. Sometimes it can be neutral. And when there is something that's pleasant, our natural habitual reaction is to want to hold on to it, to want more of it. This is part of our very basic survival mechanism for helping us find food and remember where food is. If something is unpleasant, we have a craving to make it go away, or an aversion to it. And this too helps us avoid danger. When we see danger, we learn to avoid it. So both of these lead to behaviors, to approaching things that are pleasant, for example, calories that help us survive, and remembering where food is and what food is nourishing so we can eat it, and also avoiding things that are not helpful for survival, such as danger. So these behaviors then get laid down in our memories. In the ancient, the Buddhist psychology, they talk about this birth of a self-identity. In modern day, we talk about the formation of memory. We learn to remember where danger is. We learn to remember where nourishment is, so we can avoid danger and we can move toward nourishment. And this forms habits, and these behaviors get reinforced. Now, if you look at the ancient psychology, they talk about the first link. There are these 12 links in this dependent origination. The first link is described as ignorance. Now, I'm using a pair of glasses here because in modern day psychology, we talk about subjective bias. We become biased based on our previous experience. And this bias may be what forms a sense of self. Whatever we think and ponder upon thus becomes the inclination of the mind. Now, there's a modern day philosopher, Alan Watts, who died several decades ago, but the way he describes the sense of self, he calls the ego. He says the self, which he has believed himself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. So what this suggests is, this idea that the more we think and ponder upon, thus becomes the inclination of the mind, that this self gets formed through, it gets reinforced through positive and negative reinforcement, as is described in modern day psychology. Now, another way to this is described, and there was an article written about 10 years ago by Dembrin and Matthew Ricard, where they talk about self-centered psychological functioning. And they say it includes characteristics such as biased self-interest, egoism, egocentrism, and egotism. So ego, ego, ego. And this bias can get formed through these natural survival mechanisms. So the more we start to identify with certain behaviors or certain thoughts, the more we think, this is who I am. And the more we get attached to those views, the more this theoretically can cause suffering, the more this can trip us up. I'm going to give you an example. This is Lolo Jones. She's an Olympic hurdler, a three-time Olympian. Back in 2008, she was favored to win the gold medal at the Beijing Olympics. And in fact, she had made it through all of the preliminary rounds and was in the finals. Not only was she in the finals, she was in the lead, and she was at the 9th of 10 hurdles. In an interview with Time Magazine, she said, I was in an amazing rhythm. I was, and she described how she wasn't thinking, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. She said it just felt like another race. And then she started telling herself to make sure her legs were snapping out. So she was talking to herself. She said, that's when I hit the hurdle. So she tripped up. She tripped herself up on the very end of the race of the finals of the Olympics. And the reason I tell this story is because this is a good example of how this self gets formed, and then we think it is helpful. But as one teacher put it, we get in our own way. Your me is in the way. And this process can get reinforced to the point where we can even read it out in the brain. So there's a network of brain regions called the default mode network. And it was called the default mode network because it is what we default to when we aren't doing anything in particular. When we're not focused on a task, we are defaulting to what's described as self-referential thinking. We most commonly think about ourselves. Often we're thinking about something that's happened in the past, often regretting it, or we're worrying about the future. And in fact, this network has been shown to be activated, or this defaulting to self-referential thinking can happen up to 50% of waking life, where that's just what we're defaulting to. Now, this network of brain regions has a lot of different brain regions, but I'm going to focus on two in particular: the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. You can see these are the hubs of this network of brain regions. They're right in the middle. And they're also in the middle of the brain. They're in the midline. The posterior cingulate more toward the back of the brain. This is the back, this is the front. The medial prefrontal cortex more in the front, but they're in the midline of the brain. The reason I bring these brain regions up is that they get activated when we think about ourselves. And they also get activated when we get triggered. Here are some examples. So for example, in a study of adolescents who were shown their own Instagram feeds, but the only change, the only experimental manipulation that was made in this study was where the experimenters gave some of the pictures a lot of likes and some of the pictures just a few likes. And when they compared many likes versus just a few likes, they activated these reward centers in their brain, the nucleus accumbens being one of them. This is this brain region that gets activated with all drugs of abuse. Dopamine fires and it activates this brain region. What they also found was that this self-referential network was activated. So there's something rewarding about getting a lot of likes when there's something about us. This brain region also gets activated when people who are addicted to cocaine are shown pictures of cocaine. When they're triggered, you can see the posterior cingulate getting activated. It also lights up when people who are addicted to cigarettes are shown pictures of people smoking. You can see medial prefrontal cortex, and it's in particular the posterior cingulate cortex. This also happens with gambling, when people who are addicted to gambling are shown gambling scenes. And it even activates when people are fed chocolate. And this study was done over 20 years ago, but is very interesting because what they had people do was they were using PET imaging so they could feed them chocolate while they were scanning their brain. And they had people rate how much they liked the chocolate. And they were also, I should say, they were feeding them their favorite chocolate. So at the beginning of the experiment, people were saying, wow, this is really delicious. And they were activating their posterior cingulate cortex. So I really want more chocolate was activating the posterior cingulate. They kept feeding them chocolate throughout the experiment and the ratings went down. You can imagine the more you eat chocolate, the less excited you are to eat chocolate. So by the end of the experiment, people were saying, eating more would make me feel sick. This is awful. Interestingly, at both ends of the spectrum, I really want more, I really want less. They were both activating the posterior cingulate cortex. So this network of brain regions seems to get activated, especially the posterior cingulate cortex, the more we want things and the more averse we are to things. For example, worrying. When we worry about the future, the more we worry, the more the medial prefrontal cortex and the more the posterior cingulate cortex get activated. So the more we get caught up, the more we trip ourselves up, the more these networks get activated. In fact, I'll show you all of the different types of things that can activate the default mode network, and in particular, these two regions of the default mode network. In particular, the posterior cingulate gets activated when we're not doing anything in particular, as I've mentioned, when we're mind wandering, when we're just letting our minds wander freely, when we're thinking about ourselves in the past and the future, when we're judging ourselves, when we're looking at words and deciding whether they describe us or not. This gets activated when we think about ourselves in social situations, when we like a choice that we've made. We've just made a choice and we think, oh yeah, that's a good choice. It gets activated. I'm just showing you, even induced immoral behaviors, care and justice issues, when we feel guilty, emotional processing, and then of course, as I mentioned, one of my favorites, cravings. So all of these different things activate the posterior cingulate cortex, this center of a self-referential brain network. So how does all of this come together? We've had a working hypothesis for a while now that the posterior cingulate is involved in this experiential sense of self, this feeling of this is me versus the rest of the world, as compared to the concept of self. If I look in the mirror and I think about my name or something, that concept of self, just a conceptual thing, not a felt experience, may not be that experiential sense of self, and that may be more represented in the medial prefrontal cortex. If we think about what this is like, we can really explore how this relates to self and the ego. So I'm going to go back to this quote from Dambrin and Richard, where they talked, I already mentioned this first part, self-centered psychological functioning includes characteristics such as biased self-interest, egoism, egocentrism, and egotism. So, they talk about, in contrast, they use the term selflessness to qualify the self's alternative psychological functioning. They describe it as being characterized by low levels of self-centeredness, a low degree of importance given to the self. They say this style of psychological functioning is closely related to characteristics such as altruism, kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion. And so what they're suggesting is that the more we get caught up in our experience, the more we get the sense of self. What this might line up with is activation of this default mode network, activation of this self-referential network. And we can actually test this experimentally. So mindfulness training trains us in these skills of not being caught up in ourselves, and getting out of our own way. If you think of the Lolo Jones story, where she got in her own way, she tripped herself up. Mindfulness trains us not to get caught up in those self-referential processing networks. And what I'm also going to show you now is that certain psychedelics may also help do the same thing. So there's been a lot of research from a number of different labs over the past decade, where they've been looking at brain activity when people are given psychedelics. So this is the active ingredient. So psilocybin, for example, is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And the first study that was published with psychedelics was by Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt at University College London back in 2012, where they found that when people were given psilocybin, you can see the main hubs of this default mode network, the posterior cingulate and the medial prefrontal cortex, were deactivated relative to getting a placebo. You can see this in different methods of measuring brain activity. So the blood oxygen level dependent signal, and also looking at cerebral blood flow. When they combine that, you can see the same thing is true. Now, they've followed this up with a number of different studies where they look with different modalities. So they looked using a methodology called arterial spin labeling. You can see deactivations in these two hubs of the default mode network, as I just showed you with the bold signal. And they even find this when they use EEG-related methodologies, megaloencephalography. So different types of measuring brain activity all show the same thing, which is that there's less activity in these hubs of the default mode network, less activity in the self-referential networks when people are given psilocybin. Another mind-expanding substance called ayahuasca, which has been used in indigenous cultures in Central and South America, also deactivates the default mode network. This is a study that was published a little while ago, and you can see the same deactivation with this different substance. And in fact, you can see that when this substance is provided, that it actually decouples these two main hubs of the default mode network. So the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex tend to be what are called functionally coupled. So they're functionally connected, meaning that when one is activated, the other is activated. When one is deactivated, the other is deactivated. Yet psychedelics do something very interesting that is rarely seen in science, where when one is activated, so here they look to see when the medial prefrontal cortex is activated, what else is activated? Well, in fact, shown here in blue, the posterior cingulate cortex is deactivated. Typically, the two are activated at the same time. You can see this is what a typical functional connectivity pattern looks like. So when the posterior cingulate is active, the medial prefrontal cortex is active. But when given psilocybin, when the medial prefrontal cortex is active, the posterior cingulate cortex is deactivated. So these two are now decoupled. Another study done with experienced meditators who were given psilocybin during a meditation retreat found that when this decoupling is happening, so when these two are not talking to each other, people report a higher level of what's described as oceanic self-boundlessness. So they're losing this sense of self and they're starting to merge with the world around them. There's this loss of a sense of self. Now, I mention all of this because the psychedelics are suggesting something that, these are literally called mind-expanding drugs, where the mind is expanded, the sense of self starts to dissolve, where there's just awareness and one is not feeling like, here I am and here's the rest of the world. There's just an awareness where that self is not bounded. There's this self-boundlessness. And in fact, some of the first studies that my lab has done with experienced meditators has found that these two hubs of the default mode network are deactivated across a number of different types of meditation in experienced meditators relative to people who have not learned to meditate before. So in this study, we brought in people who had never meditated. We taught them meditation on the day that we were scanning their brains. And we compared their brain activity to experienced meditators, people who had been meditating for years. And when we looked across 3 different types of meditations, we looked at concentration meditation, where people were just focusing on their breath. We looked at a loving kindness meditation, where people were practicing a kind of selfless love. And we also looked at what's called choiceless awareness, where people were just aware of whatever was happening in their experience. And here, across 3 different types of meditation, blue shows a deactivation in experienced meditators versus novices. So we are seeing this as people are meditating, they're deactivating this self-referential network. This is very similar to what people have found with ayahuasca and with psilocybin. So there's a lot of overlap between taking a substance that is mind expanding and learning to meditate, which is also geared toward letting go of a sense of self. Now, these are experienced meditators. So we wanted to see if the same is true with novices when we looked at them across time. So we did a study with people who wanted to quit smoking. And the way we did this study was that we brought them into our lab and we scanned their brains when we showed them pictures of people smoking versus neutral cues. And we could measure how much their posterior cingulate cortex was activated at baseline. Then we could randomize them to get a mindfulness training app called Craving to Quit, which helped them use mindfulness techniques to learn to let go and ride out cravings to smoke, versus our National Cancer Institute in the US has an app that's more based on cognitive therapy. And after a month, we could scan their brains again to see how much their default mode network changed in activity when they were shown these smoking cues again, and how that correlated with outcomes. We want to see if changes in this default mode network actually correlate with real-world clinical outcomes. And what we found was that there was a strong correlation between a reduction in posterior cingulate activity and a reduction in cigarettes smoked. So you can see this correlation was 0.4. It was a pretty strong correlation. There was no correlation in people who got cognitive therapy. And in fact, the more modules people completed, the better they did. But this was specific to the mindfulness training group. What this suggests is that training ourselves in mindfulness, to train ourselves to not get caught up in a craving to smoke, the more that we train ourselves to do that, the less active our posterior cingulate gets when we are shown cues. We're less triggered. Our brain is less triggered, and we are less likely to smoke a cigarette. So this suggests that mindfulness training can target these specific brain networks, the default mode network in particular, and targeting the default mode network correlates with real-world clinical outcomes. Now, we've also done studies with looking specifically at kindness practices. The loving kindness practice is the most commonly taught meditation in mindfulness training. And the idea is that when we practice selfless kindness, this is not about the ego centers of the brain. It's about deactivating these ego centers of the brain. And in fact, that's exactly what we found. When we looked at meditators versus novices practicing loving kindness, we see a large decrease in activity in the posterior cingulate in particular, both the posterior cingulate as well as the precuneus. So it's not just about focusing on the breath. It's not just about just being aware. Even kindness has been shown to directly correlate with deactivations in this egocentric brain network. Now, what we wanted to do was see exactly how these lined up. So we did a series of experiments where we could, I'll just skip this, where we could give people feedback from their own brains while they were meditating. And we could also do some control experiments to make sure that they weren't fooling themselves. I won't go into those in the interest of time. But what this looks like is that we can line up their subjective experience to see if and what their subjective experience is lining up with in terms of their brain activity. So for example, we can, as somebody is in our scanner, we can show them how active or deactivated their posterior cingulate is. So red here shows an increase in posterior cingulate activity. Blue is a decrease. And across short meditation runs, we would do 1 to 3 minutes. We would have people watch their own brain activity. And then right at the end of the scan, we would stop the scan and ask them what happened. Here's an example. This person said, I caught myself. I was trying to guess where the words were going to end. That was our baseline task. And when the meditation was going to begin. So I was kind of trying to be like, okay, ready, set, go. And then there was an additional word that popped up. So this was still the baseline task, and the person thought he was ready to start meditating. And he was thinking, oh no. And then at that point, his brain got really activated. And then he said, and then I sort of immediately settled in and I was really getting into it. And you can see this correlated with decreased brain activity in his posterior cingulate. And then I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It's describing exactly what I'm saying. And then you see this red spike. So he was getting excited. And as he got excited, his brain got more activated. And I was like, okay, wait, don't get distracted. And then I got back into it. And then it got blue again. So as he started meditating again, that brain activity quieted down. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable. It's doing exactly what my mind is doing. So he was laughing at this point. He said it got really red again. And so he said, I find it really funny because it's, to the next question, that's a perfect map of what my mind was going through. So what you can see here is we can line up their brain activity pretty precisely with their subjective experience. And then we can use techniques called neurophenomenology, where we can use their first person, their self-report, what they're describing, so that we can really understand these cognitive processes in the brain. And in this case, we used a method called grounded theory method, which isn't, the details aren't that important right now. But I can show you what we can do with this methodology. So we can have people who are completely blinded to our hypotheses just start to categorize all of the subjective experience that people report. So if somebody reports tranquility, it goes in a certain category. If they report being focused on their body or their nostrils, or focused on other sensations because they're meditating, this can go into what's called an open code. And then we can combine these into more central codes and then into theoretical codes. And then we can line this up with their brain activity. So what this looks like is we can take all the instances when we see that spike, that red spike, and we can line those up to see what they're lining up with. So for example, all these instances when people were distracted, their posterior cingulate was getting activated. This is very much in line with many other studies showing that when people are mind wandering, their posterior cingulate gets activated. Yet we also found another category that we just called controlling. The more people tried to control their experience, the more their brain activity was also increasing. So this was different than just mind wandering. It was also the more they were trying to do something, the more it was getting activated. Here's an example. Someone said, I worried I wasn't using the graph as an object of meditation. So I tried to look at it harder or somehow pay attention more to it. So they were trying to pay attention. This is when their brain activity increased. So that's a very interesting observation that says it's not just about the self. It's about when we're really trying to do something, even when we're trying to meditate. In contrast, our brains get deactivated. The posterior cingulate gets deactivated when we are focused. When we're very concentrated, there were lots of instances when people were focused and their posterior cingulate was deactivated. Now, this is also consistent with other literature, not just in meditators, but when somebody's focused on a task, their default mode network is deactivated. Yet, interestingly, we also found what we described as effortless doing was also deactivating the default mode network. Here's an example. This person said, toward the middle, I had some thoughts, which I don't see on the graph, maybe because I let them flow by. So it's not about not having thoughts. It's about how we're relating to our thoughts. This person, they said that I let them flow by, and you can see their brain was deactivated. This other person said, I noticed the more I relaxed and stopped trying to do anything, the bluer it went. In one of the very famous movie trilogies, from the US is Star Wars, and there's this scene in the second movie, The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke Skywalker is trying to learn how to use his mind. And Yoda, his teacher, says, no, try not, because Luke was trying to do something. He was trying to levitate some boxes. And Yoda was saying, no, this is about doing. Do or do not. There is no try. And what this suggests is that trying is actually a sense of selfing, of doing, of efforting. And the opposite of that can be described, there's a concept called flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi described flow as this mental state when a person is fully immersed in the present moment, feeling energized and focused. Csikszentmihalyi also describes flow as being selfless. There is no self. There's just this merging of action and awareness. So when we're resting in awareness, there's just awareness. We're not doing anything. We're not trying to do anything. There's just stuff that is happening. And this may be very, very similar to what is happening when people are using psychedelics. When they're fully in a psychedelic experience, there's an awareness and there's a loss of a sense of self. So if we think about this, flow being a loss of a sense of self, we can even see this in brain activity. So for example, in the studies we were doing, somebody spontaneously reported a sense of flow. They said, being with the breath, flow deepened in the middle. And you can see the posterior cingulate activity was really decreased as they were getting into flow. So what this suggests, bringing all of this together, what this may suggest is that the more we just rest in a sense of awareness, whether we train to do that with meditation or whether the brain is kind of pushed into that mode with psychedelics, the psychedelics start to break down these boundaries between the self and other. And we lose a sense of where we are and where the rest of the world is, which may be a false boundary in the first place, because there's just awareness when somebody is on a psychedelic. This may also be true with meditation. As we train ourselves not to notice what it feels like to get caught up in self, the more we can start to notice that we can let go and we can just rest in an awareness that is expanded, that knows no boundaries, that doesn't say, here I am and here's the rest of the world. This awareness is just aware, which also brings us back to this original question that I posed, or I should say the question that Dazu Hoika posed to Bodhidharma. Just as a reminder, Hoika said, my mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind. Bodhidharma said, bring me your mind and I will pacify it. Hoika says, when I look for my mind, I cannot find it. Bodhidharma then replies, there, I have pacified it for you. So it's not that sense of, a sense of self, that mind may be this false concept that we have habituated through timeless repetition. As I mentioned at the beginning, this dependent origination or positive and negative reinforcement as described in modern day psychology. The more we think and ponder upon, the more we worry about the future, the more we become identified with being somebody who worries, which makes our minds not at ease. And the more we can notice and just bring awareness in, notice thoughts, notice emotions, notice body sensations, and not take them personally, the more that awareness expands and can hold these as phenomena that arise and pass away. What this also suggests, bringing this together with psychedelics, is that psychedelics may help us start to experience what it is like to be in a selfless awareness state. So I think of these as helping people see what is possible, that it is possible to have an awareness that is not bounded in a sense of self. Many of us do not know what that feels like. And so what the experiments are suggesting is that when people are, take a psychedelic, a guided psychedelic trip, as they describe it, that this guided trip can help people get a sense of what that's like. And what I would suggest is that mindfulness training can help us train to do this without the psychedelics. And people are starting to study now whether you can combine those two, where psychedelics might help give people a sense of what is possible so that we can train ourselves to move in that direction. To bring this together as a very simple concept, that sense of getting caught up in experience feels contracted, feels closed down. We can start to notice what it feels like to be closed down. And as we notice what that closed down feeling feels like, we can notice how it feels compared to being open up. So for example, my lab has done studies looking at mind states, the different mind states of that we all experience. And we've had people rank which mind states feel better. So for example, when somebody's anxious, when somebody's frustrated, when somebody's angry, these tend to be ranked as lower, and they don't feel as good as mind states such as curiosity or kindness or connectedness. And at the same time, we've done studies asking people which one feels more closed and which one feels more open. With anger, with frustration, with craving, it tends to feel closed. And with connection, with kindness, with curiosity, these mind states feel more open. And so what these might be helping us to train ourselves to do is just to notice what it feels like to feel closed. When we get caught up in anxiety, when we get caught up in anger, we can start to notice what that closed state feels like. And then we can compare it to how it feels when we're kind. And that kindness, because it feels better, because that open state feels better, our minds may naturally incline themselves in that direction. To highlight this, as this teacher, Jean-Jacques Haubner puts it, the ego is a bottomless pit of suckiness. And so you finally let go of the self that clings to itself. True freedom comes when ego goes. The reason I bring this forward is he highlights how getting caught up in a sense of self, in fact, is much more painful. As Hoyka put it, the mind is not at ease. And yet, when we start to notice how painful it is, we might naturally start to let go. It's like a hot coal that we're holding. All we need to do is pay attention and bring awareness in, and we start to notice we're going to naturally drop that coal. Psychedelics may give us this sense of how expanded the mind can actually get. And as we start to notice that, we can train ourselves to move in that direction simply by training awareness toward how it feels when we're caught up in a sense of self, and awareness of how it feels of when we let go. So it will be very interesting over the next few years as we move into the future, as people start to explore the ways to bring together psychedelics and mindfulness training so that we can help people know the direction and also train themselves to move in that direction naturally. And that's what my true hope is with mindfulness training, is that we can really use this as a way to help us see just how good it feels to let go of that sense of self, to let go of the ego as we move more and more into awareness, as we move more and more into curiosity, and also as we really start to taste how good it feels to be kind as compared to unkind to others. So I will wrap this up here with this quote from a poem by Rumi wrote, where he says, "Be empty of worrying. Think of who created thought. Why do you stay in prison when the door is so wide open? Move outside the tangle of fear thinking, live in silence, flow down and down in always widening rings of being. I love this quote because this highlights this wideness, this widening of awareness, these widening rings of being, as he puts it. And he also highlights how we get in our own way when we create our own prison, when we worry, we get our brain networks get activated, we get caught up in this tangle of fear thinking. And as we simply start to live in silence, we can flow down and down. We can move out of that prison, as he says. We can flow down and down in always widening rings of being. So I'm very hopeful that as we learn more and more about the neuroscience of how psychedelics work, and as we learn more and more about the neuroscience of how mindfulness training works, we can see how these can work together to help us all collectively flow down and down in always widening rings of being and greater connection. So I'll end there. I just want to thank all of the different people that contributed to this work. And most of this work was funded by our National Institutes of Health by a number of different grants. And if you're interested in learning more about this work, I have a website that lists a lot of these resources and has some other resources. But if nothing else, just remember the poet Mary Oliver puts it very simply. She says, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So that astonishment, that wonder, that awe is that widening ring of being. So I will end there, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, if you have any, about what I've talked about today.
네, 저슨 브로우 교수님 좋은 발표 잘 들었습니다. 저슨 브로우 교수님께서 신경생물학에서 얻은 통찰에 관해 강의해 주셨고 지금 질문을 기다리고 계시는데요. 두 개의 질문이 들어왔습니다. 첫 번째 질문부터 드리도록 하겠습니다. 지금까지 명상을 통한 건강 개선 같은 명상의 효과에 대해 연구가 있었는데요. 박사님 같이 중독을 통한 자아의 집착을 강조하는 연구는 많지 않았습니다. 이 부분과 불교의 무아와의 공통점이 있을까요? 입니다.
That's a really good question. There's some people that argue that self is an addiction itself. So the more we become identified with whoever we think we are, I could be identified with being a professor or a researcher or a physician. And if somebody says, oh, you're not a very good physician, that the more identified I am with that idea, oh, I'm a good physician, the more that sense of self is an addiction because it causes suffering. The simple definition of addiction that I find very helpful is continued use despite adverse consequences. And so we can think of the self as the continued use, the continued thinking of this is who I am despite adverse consequences. And so I think these concepts of no self lines up very nicely with addiction. Addiction is this sense of, the more I think this is who I am, the more that could even be an addiction. There's a paper, I think, written called The Ontological Theory of Addiction, which basically highlights how these Buddhist concepts very much describe, this addiction to self, and that addiction to self is what causes suffering in the first place. Interestingly, in the Buddhist concepts, this dependent origination is what the Buddha was said to have been contemplating on the night of his enlightenment. So he was suggesting when we can step away from that addiction to self, it may lead to great things in his case, becoming enlightened.
네, 아마 좋은 답변이 되셨을 거라고 생각됩니다. 두 번째 질문이 있습니다. 명상을 하게 되면 디폴트 모드의 연결은 강하지만 디폴트 모드 영역 자체의 활성도는 약해지게 될까요? 이것을 바이오 마커로도 적용할 수 있을까요? 라는 질문입니다.
It's a very good question. So yes, what we found is that these two main hubs of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, both get deactivated with meditation. What I didn't show you today, but we published in our first paper, was that when we look at the connectivity between the posterior cingulate and other parts of the brain, that connectivity is very different in experienced versus novice meditators. What we find is that there are certain networks, for example, the posterior cingulate is more connected to working memory parts of the brain in experienced meditators. And interestingly, this network connectivity happens not only during meditation, but also at baseline when they aren't even meditating. And we also find that there's an increased connectivity with the posterior cingulate and a network called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, which is typically not the case with people who have not trained in meditation. What that suggests is that they're more on the lookout for a sense of self, that the dorsal anterior cingulate's involved in monitoring. So one interpretation of this is that they are training themselves to habitually monitor for the emergence of a sense of self. And as we monitor for that emergence of a sense of self, we can see how painful it is to be contracted and naturally let go. In experienced meditators, that's happening not just during meditation, but also at baseline. With novice meditators, they increase that connectivity, but it's only during meditation. What that suggests is that we can actually train ourselves to be in the habit of being aware and being on the lookout for self. And what that suggests is that we can also, that makes it easier to step out of these habitual modes of self-referential processing.